I met a little fella by the name of Warpug from the Free World League. Loud and very ugly, living his best pug life. Had him dreaming of being a much warrior pilot, sitting on his grandma's lap and he's fighting to pose. The boy would shy away from nothing. That's a jag. Warpug pointed at it. I don't think it's a cat. I think this person might be my dad. That's a battle master. Oh no, excuse me, my hand slipped and destroyed my accident. Warpug destroyed me again. Warpug destroyed another lance. Like he said he would know, he didn't even apologize. Warpug did it to you. Little Warpug, not like the kindest guy. Unsportsmanlike, shoot your legs and Warpug die. An eye for an eye, a man 5'9" and a hateful rise. Shooting DCK players like they shot Cujo. Little pug dog with a burgundy coat. Warpug destroy me again. Warpug destroy me again. Warpug did it to you. Warpug destroyed another lance, like he said he would, and then laughed in your face at the beginning. Warpug did it to you, and laughed in your face again. He would, and then laughed in your face at the beginning. Warpug did it to you, and laughed in your face again. Like you say he would, and then laughed in your face at the beginning. Warpug did it to you, and laughed in your face again. Like he said he would. No, he didn't even apologize. Warpug did it to you, and laughed in your face again.
Warpugs! Hey guys! Guys, it is time to learn about, well, the Banshee. And apparently this is part of the Steiner Scout Squadron, I guess. I'm not sure. But it's an old meme, but it checks out. Warpugs, how is everybody doing? Is everybody doing okay? I'm just sitting here, honestly, it has been a day for me. It's been a lot, and I mean a lot of rain today. A lot of thunder, everything like that. What's up, Mitch? You got your Spam, chips, and Coke at the ready for this? Spam, you got to be careful. You got to be very careful with cheap food. I mean, if you can eat cheap food one at a time, okay? You can think of doing cheap food one at a time. But the second you start trying to add two cheap foods together, then you've already messed up, okay? Cheap, store-bought mac and cheese, the powder mac and cheese, not the Velveeta stuff, and Spam is a combination made by the devil. I'm just saying. Big Red is in the house. Hey, Big Red, what's up, bud? We're going to be checking out the remastered version of this, because I was told to by several people. But, Zeke, how's it going, bud? I just saw your comment. And speaking of which, I am going to be checking out something new from the SCP universe here pretty soon. Is the hospital recovering from a fall? Yes, she is. She is okay. She kind of bruised her ankle when she fell. I make fun of her because she fell on flat level ground, but it's something that happened. Like she had an injury a while ago before I even started the channel, where the ankle that she fell on sometimes just doesn't hold up. And it is what it is. Nothing can be done for it. It's just something she has to deal with every once in a while. It is what it is. 3M and 5M best version of the Banshee. The thing I really like about this is I get to learn about the different versions of it. Whenever I start doing my own stuff here, I'm going to be focusing more on people because I rant about people. That's what I'm best at. I rant about people, like the ultimate schmug one. The Vets versus Angry Cops, yeah, the Battle of Athens, Vegas before Vegas, Pat himself gathered some tanks there and threatened to flatten their city. That's not surprising. Warpugs, and I will say this, if you are a member of our Patreon, pretty soon, I might already have it up, but somehow Kentucky Ballistics, demonstrating standard Kentucky behavior, got himself a hold of a T-Rex skull made out of ballistics gel. Don't ask me how. It's an actual ballistics gel T-Rex skull. I don't know. And he shot it with everything short of the punt gun, okay? Yeah, exactly, Mal. Exactly, Mad Mergen. When I saw the thumbnail, I was just like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, every single time he does something, I'm like, what? Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. In a week, this channel will hit 40,000 subscribers. In a week. Don't know what to say about that. I do know what I did. I did something that I haven't done before. So, pretty stupid of me. But no, Captain Commander, I didn't do a crime. But, yeah, I did something remarkably stupid, and I'm okay with that. But, yeah, I'm editing that video as we speak. I have a lot of plans for the future. I just don't have enough time. That's the thing. But with things going as they are, eventually I will be moving, and I will hopefully be moving to full-time content creation at some point in the next year or two. And that will be... No, I wish, Captain. I wish. First thing that would happen is I'd write a letter to Brew Alpha Boost and let him know to continue his good work, and he has the full blessing. Yeah, that's what I do that instantaneously. Anyway, shutting up. It's the Banshee, okay? It's the Banshee, and not the Banshee that the chaotic good barbarian got a hold of. I'm just saying. Let's get into this. X in chat if you're ready for some Banshee action. How Steiner will use it. There we go. Let's go. Is the plank full of chocolate? What? $30.25.
A lumbering giant looms large over the world of Battletech. From ancient times until the most recent, desperate effort and clash for survival across human space. This creature of engineered steel and myomers, however, was shackled with a bleak reputation, one which was in place for much of its existence. Instead of bearing the proud legacy that its creators imagined for it, it was associated mostly with 3 words: obsolete, unwanted, and despised.
This is already giving me buff vibes, if y'all know what I mean by buff.
An inspired titan became the paper tiger of the Inner Sphere in the years that followed the rise of the Star League. Only through the strife-filled straits of the Succession Wars, and simply because they were left in storage for use, did this primordial war machine begin to emerge onto the battlefields once more, and to disastrous effect for those that piloted it, or were forced to rely upon it. Stagnation and decline across the human empires that span the stars, though, meant that machines as unfavorable as this failed venture had some sort of home. even if they were unwanted by their operators. But stagnation does not last forever. The fires of war eventually became the forge that sharpened and hardened this dulled blade into the deadliest of edges.
Nice.
What was once considered awful gained in value rapidly, becoming one of the strongest battle mechs to walk across the inner sphere. And this took place just in time, as the clan invasion swept into the Great Houses only a handful of years later. The Lyran half of the Federated Commonwealth, the power responsible for reshaping this weapon into a brutal fighting machine, found themselves clinging onto vain hopes for survival. The mech they reforged was then tested against this new foe, and every foe that has arisen since. In this overview, we are going to examine the stories and history around one of the most iconic weapons platforms in the history of Battletech. But more than that, this is a tale of a battle mech going from the obscure corners of history and being launched into the center stage of some of the most destructive and consequential fighting ever. So, without any reason left to delay, let us examine this once slumbering Terran juggernaut.
So when I think about mechs that I know about with my passing knowledge, playing a couple of games and stuff like that, the Banshee is not one of them. I, of course, know about the Atlas. I know about the Timberwolf, aka the Mad Cat. I know about the Catapult, the King Crab, things of that nature. I know about the Locust. I know about the Flea Spider. I know these mechs. The Banshee is not one that I know of. So, it's time to learn something new about Battletech, guys.
The Banshee.
Good reason this is not a notable one for a long time. Ah, okay, Big Red.
It hit me then that my colleagues and I had just turned loose one of the most powerful weapons ever conceived by man, but we were celebrating like giddy children, while my companions jumped up and down with glee. That poor boy was trying to hide the fact that in the instant his screen went black, he had wet his pants.
Nice.
The Hegemony Research and Development Department, Military Weapons Systems Division, Document 0324610.04, Comstar Archives, Terra.
Imagine, if you will, your major contribution to history is being known as that one dude that pissed himself. That's gotta suck. A new age of warfare. Hey, Gearstark. Banshee and Buff Voice. I may be old, but I'll make those clanners bend over and cry. Jesus, bro.
The Banshee's journey truly does not start with the Succession Wars, or even with the famed Star League of old, but at the very dawn of the battle mech itself. To understand it in its entirety, we must begin our exploration there. The 25th century was an era of turmoil and conflict. This was also where the great powers of the Inner Sphere all began to emerge, almost like celestial bodies forming around a newborn star. The major nations of the Inner Sphere began to coalesce, as their political, military, and economic gravities seemed to draw in worlds and lesser powers around them.
All hail the Oscar the Grouch mech, brought up by Matthew right there.
The new lords of these great powers were the embodiment of avarice, always craving more glory, more territories, and the ability to dominate their neighbors.
Karita.
At the very core of human space, though, lay the star at the center of this political solar system. Terra's first stellar empire had collapsed sometime earlier, with the death of the Terran Alliance, though it was not the oldest of the Great Houses, as the Free Worlds League had come together prior to this new iteration of the Terran Empire. But this new state was still at the central point of power in human space. Backed by the most sophisticated military-industrial complex in human history to this point, the Terran Hegemony, the successor to the Alliance, was always at the bleeding edge of military and technological developments.
Okay.
No one could foresee, however, the massive leap that the hegemony was about to make in terms of battlefield technologies, near the middle of the century, during the Age of War. Director General Jacob Cameron.
That 80s artwork. Oh my god. Does he not look like the dude from the casino from Mars Attacks? Does he not? Who knows what I'm talking about right here? The dude in the casino in Mars Attacks. That is this dude right here. Okay? Seriously. 100%.
While he was not the inventor of the battle mech,
Captain Commander, I mean, you're not half wrong.
Was its greatest champion. As ruthless as any of his House Lord peers across human space, Jacob had attempted to dominate his neighbors through much of his reign through flexing the hegemony's military might, and the military domination of nearby powers became much more likely in 2439, after the first demonstration by the Hegemony Research and Development Department.
Got a bullet? Yep. Best in the front, party in the back. Yep.
Of the battle mech. This was the year of the successful test for the Mackie. Marrying advanced myomer technologies, in essence advanced synthetic muscles, with a humanoid frame, and for the time cutting-edge weaponry, they had created something not only unique, but also absolutely dominating. This was, at the time, a leap in technology well beyond anything anyone had yet seen, and the Director General recognized it as such. He knew the potential of these platforms, and would not allow this opportunity to slip through his fingers. Every possible resource was reoriented towards the production of these new devastating weapons of war.
I have always found it absolutely comical, 100% comical, that they would put the brand name on the bottom of the shoe just so the person getting stepped on knows who made the boot that's stepping on them. That is such a hater move, okay? That is such a hater move. And I fucking love it, okay?
New, advanced factory complexes were built in the safest regions of Terra's holdings. Every element of the military's budget was raided for revenue to progress this advantage, and eventually, so too was the civilian government's budget.
Exactly, Gearstark.
Jacob Cameron bled his realm white in terms of its productive capacity and tax revenue to ensure that these breakthrough systems would be prioritized to ensure their military supremacy against all other states. Terran industries and infrastructure were built up for this machine to be mass-produced, with 6 factories being put into full production by the end of its development. It's important to point out that early battle mechs in general were all very primitive in nature, regardless of their success or lack thereof on the battlefield. They were burdened with extremely heavy engines and very poor protection compared to any modern battle mech, using technologies even simpler than what would be considered intro tech.
And this isn't that big of a surprise if you take a look at, like, the way that technology evolved when it comes to, like, Navy ships. If you took a look at the HMS Dreadnought, if you took a look at the Dreadnought and then put it up against the Iowa class, the Iowa class has so much armor, so much heavier weaponry, so much everything better, that it's almost comical to consider the two were the terrors of their day in terms of the high seas. The Dreadnought was only a couple of decades behind, actually. I mean, that's just really what it boiled down to. So, yeah, this is not surprising in the slightest. I love that they took that into effect in Battletech, and they actually made this part a key part of the whole series.
By the standards of anything that followed, the Mackie was slow, poorly defended, and inadequately armed for its tonnage. But to the opponents of the hegemony, it was a demon. While all other mechs descended from this bizarre construct in some way, the Mackie also directly led to another much more innovative and advanced battlemech for the time. Its time at the top of the mountain, even within the hegemony armed forces, was not very long.
And see, Matthew, I agree with Big Red here. The comparing two universes is always kind of difficult because you got to look at what the whole geopolitical. I mean, the whole reason the battle mechs exist is because of the geopolitical situation, everything like that. That's why when people ask who would win in a fight, Star Wars versus 40K, stuff like that, it's always weird trying to compare the two things because of how the difference between them. But yeah, let's go.
The very people involved with the construction of the original battle mech, in fact, believed they could build a much better product. Contractors and staff from the project began to propose developing a more refined fighting machine.
Yay!
And one which would surpass their first work in all ways which mattered most. The true advantage of the Battlemech's body plan could be built upon, enhancing the machine based off of its human frame. Gone would be the visage of a waddling robot from the 1950s,
Boo.
one which lacked true arms or grace. No, what they had in mind was a revolution, upon the breakthrough design they had already made, pushing boundaries beyond where they were seemingly set by the first in class only a few years prior. It only took a few days of the first battlemech being adopted and being put into the field that this development process pushed ahead to expand the range of platforms. Terra, through hegemony weapons research, wanted its manufacturers to deliver another devastating battlemech in the same vein as their first Colossus.
Okay.
But this time, due to lessons learned, it'd be something vastly more refined and substantially more evolved. When the hegemony armed forces began launching competitions for new designs, the first victory was an upset and went to Martinson Armaments for their revolutionary 45-ton battlemech, the Cayudo, in 2443. Not willing to be upstaged again, when the next bid was put up by the Hegemony Weapons Research delivered a new, terrifying weapon of war for the age. This winner was to be a mech that, after being adopted, would be in some form of service in human space, continuously, from that moment forwards. The BNC-1E Banshee was Hegemony Weapons Research's pitch in this second competition, and it won. The team that had developed the mech took almost every lesson they could from their prior success and advanced upon it. A slightly lighter 95 tons instead of their original 100-ton offering of the Mackie, the Banshee was more smartly developed than anything.
Okay.
Unlike the Mackie, its body was not a poor impersonation of a dive suit from the early 20th century.
But why not, though?
With little arms attached to it. Instead, it was a robust, refined, and sleek mech. It took on the form of a humanoid proper, but most importantly, it expanded on something that had been untapped in the first battle mech. Mech warriors, even from these early days, were very prone to utilizing physical attacks, and the Mackie, while it could kick, certainly had no ability to functionally punch or even to grab things. What was the point behind a humanoid form if one couldn't take advantage of said ape-like shape? Hegemony Weapons Research completely agreed, and when they tackled this new design, the Banshee was built to appear more human, including having fully articulating arms and hands in response to MechWarrior feedback. In fact, the Banshee also borrowed heavily from its predecessor in terms of its weaponry.
They made a mech that could cast fists. I'm done.
Having a very similar loadout.
Seth, what's
though
up?
Its systems were all torso-mounted, instead of being arm-mounted, meaning the mech could throw punches as needed, while still firing its primary weapons. The most impressive single aspect of this new Titan, however, was that despite being almost the same size as the Mackie, despite being more sophisticated, and in spite of the fact it took only a few short years to develop, it was substantially cheaper and vastly easier to maintain.
Okay.
This made it, for the middle of the 25th century, truly a devastating weapon of war. There is often a misguided belief that war is won by superior arms, but in industrial warfare,
Logistics.
this is not the case. The army that can easily deliver supplies and keep its army in the fight the longest, so long as they are somewhat capable, will typically win a conflict. The BNC-1E
Taco
was an
Tuesday,
example of
Black Wolf.
everything that embodies, and just shows how dangerous the Terran state and its military-industrial complex were at the time. It was a mech that was more sophisticated than its predecessor, yet easier to service. It was similarly armed, yet had additional features. It was newer and functionally better in every major respect in regards to warfighting, yet cost less. This is what real advancement in military procurement looks like.
Yep.
In other words,
The opposite of Lockheed Martin.
more Banshees could be built and put into the field than the Mackie, despite it being superior to its predecessor. On top of that, the designers understood psychological warfare. The first mech to ever have a skull represented in their frame was the Banshee.
Nice.
And it produced a terror-causing effect on the forces arrayed against it. If one looked upon the Banshee in this state, and froze time upon its introduction in 2445, they would have assumed that it was the path of the future. Hundreds of these mechs were procured for the Hegemony Armed Forces. They were the steel warriors for the mightiest state in the human sphere. Unfortunately, as this legion of equipment was being assembled, and even fighting and winning wars, technology leaped ahead greatly in the years that followed its deployment. Until the latter portion of the 25th century, the Banshee 1E was truly the king of the battlefield. But in this age of technological expansion, especially as the other great houses began building their own armies of battle mechs, having taken the technology for themselves,
Of course.
the Banshee's place at the top was to be challenged sooner than its developers would have ever hoped for. The dream of permanence in the unchallenged era of Terran dominance was over, at least as to how it was envisioned by the Terran Alliance and the early days of the hegemony. The Mackie and the Banshee, very much the faces of these policies and ideas, were to fall to the wayside of history. Though the latter of these two was not given up on quite as readily, it would seem.
Hey, thanks for being a member for 4 months there, Seth. Would you rather be an officer in the SLDF Foreign Office or in the 40K Imperial Navy? Is that even a question? Put me in Battletech. I'll be in Battletech in a heartbeat. In a heartbeat, Seth.
First put into production in 2439, the Mackie is the original battle mech, at least as far as widespread production models are concerned. For all its impressiveness upon its debut, however, it, as a design, did not possess the same staying power as many other battle mechs that followed it. Crippled by its extremely primitive technology by the end of the century it was introduced, the MSK-5S Mackie was, in its day, a horrifying machine to come across all the same, even if that reputation did not last long. An assault mech weighing in at 100 tons, the Mackie definitely seems to be the first mech in all of the worst ways. It uses a primitive cockpit and other internal components. It uses standard heat sinks, of which it has 17, and this lets it run relatively cool despite its lack of advanced systems. For mobility, it runs a primitive 33-ton 360 standard engine, letting it move up to 56 kilometers per hour or 5 movement points in the tabletop game.
Yay!
This is not exceptional, but for a 100-ton assault mech, it's the expected level of mobility, even into the eras after this mech's arrival. It does mean that its mobility on the battlefield, however, is quite limited. For armored protection, the 5S has 20 tons of primitive plating, giving it 214 points of protection. This kind of armor, it should be noted, being primitive, does not offer much protection from the mech despite the immense tonnage placed into it. For armaments, things are unsurprisingly simple. The Mackie has a right arm mounted AC-5 autocannon with 1 ton of ammunition, a left arm mounted prototype PPC, and a center torso mounted large laser. The MSK-6S, its next iteration, introduced around the same time as the Banshee, is nearly identical, save for it having 2 medium lasers in the center torso, replacing out the large laser and installing an experimental AC autocannon instead of the AC-5. For its day, In both of its primitive forms, the Mackie was truly a war winner. But its day just wasn't very long.
Yeah.
To be trapped in this machine against almost any competent modern opponent is to be trapped in a tomb.
Yeah. That's always a good word to say. Big boy!
The immediate successor to the Mackie for the HAF, the BNC-1E, first built and delivered to the HAF in 2445. Made by the same team, it is very much a next-generation attempt at general mech design. Still, one of the earliest mechs ever deployed, this machine brought many innovations to the role it was placed in, like fully articulating arms. Much like the Mackie, though, it has extremely primitive technologies overall, including a primitive cockpit, basic gyro, and basic internal structure. After this, to keep the mech running cool, which it mostly runs as, it has 16 single heat sinks. While it cannot alpha strike without overheating as a result, it can almost do so, and it would take several rounds of fire for it to begin to suffer the consequences for this. Getting into its mobility, the 1E has a 28.5-ton 345 primitive fusion engine, giving it a maximum speed of 54 kilometers per hour, or 5 movement points in the tabletop game.
You gotta remember something there, Mitch. You gotta remember something. The Terran hegemony, the reason the houses existed was because of the lack of ability to communicate over long distances that the hegemony faced, well, with the first, Terran interstellar government faced. By the time that had happened, the governments of the inner sphere were already starting to really form. By the time they got the ability to communicate and basically hold that territory over vast distances.
This is not perfect, but for its era, it's not terrible. It's an assault mech, and it moves like one. For protection, it has an enormous 22.5 tons of primitive plating, giving it 240 points of armor overall. Primitive armor has many drawbacks, but at least it does have a lot of it. Once we get into its weaponry, we can see that it has 2 medium lasers mounted into the center torso, just like the original Mackie, as well as a small laser that is mounted into the head. In the left torso, it has an AC-5 autocannon, along with a standard PPC mounted in the opposite torso. This almost entirely mirrors the Mackie, save for the systems being torso-mounted. However, it does have the advantage of having a full real PPC rather than an experimental prototype. Overall, it is very much the next step in mech evolution, but it is a clear successor to the Mackie from the very start.
Okay.
Hundreds of these were built on New Earth for a reason, and later thousands of its successor design. Tragically.
That's bad. Anything with Mariana and Void with Vanos?
It's not peace through strength, but strength through peace that will be our motto.
You know that's BS. You know that is BS. Your descendants are going to bring you into shame and filth.
Director General Deborah Cameron, to assembled nobles and political leaders. April 2509.
Yay! It's time.
Terra's place at the top of the military hierarchy of the Inner Sphere was by no means guaranteed during the latter portion of the 25th through to the 26th century, despite its monumental advantage in the craft and industrial output of war. There were economic consequences to Jacob Cameron's rule, and his rush towards acquiring the battle mech at all costs for the hegemony armed forces. Jacob himself would go on to die in his early 60s from a stroke, before being succeeded by Theodore Cameron, his son. It appears that his heir was by no means the most restrained individual either.
That's always a good
Despite
sign.
banning functionally all opposition political parties with the collapse of the Terran Alliance, people still had the opportunity to vote on the heir designate when they were offered up to be the Director General. And Theodore did manage to secure his place as ruler, but there was a meaningful vote against him, 1 in 4 eligible voters, in fact, opted to not support his ascension to the title of dictator.
I got a feeling 1 in 4 people are about to go have a problem.
They turned out to be largely correct, as Theodore, despite his military background, was a decadent ruler.
Yay.
Massive, expensive, and excessive highbrow events were what his rule was most renowned for.
Great!
Outside of supporting the military's buildup, he proved to be negligent in the extreme, and he'd rather be engaging in horse races, extravagant balls, and wild parties said to be as debauched as those that came from the most infamous or famous points of human antiquity, myth, and legend.
Huh.
In fact, he used the public's purse to finance this.
Oh, of course.
As well as to finance the construction or restoration of multiple palaces for himself and his family to enjoy.
Yes, that is the one thing that people want to know their leaders are spending their hard-earned tax dollars on. Hookers blowing basically places to do it all at. Nice.
Regardless of showing some success in several conflicts, he, and later his daughter Elizabeth, who was an even worse example of dereliction of duty, jeopardized the Terran state's stability, leading to the near collapse of the hegemony's government.
Nice.
But in this chaos, the military still found its budgets, and huge steps were made in quality regarding battlemech manufacturing. This era resulted in the beginning, it may be argued, of one of the most catastrophically irresponsible events of military and industrial waste in Terra's history as well. As during this time, where leaps and bounds were being made in battlemech technologies, the hegemony did a massive refit program for several of their now slightly out-of-date designs.
Okay.
Including the Banshee. In 2475, a new cutting-edge configuration of the Banshee was unveiled to the public. The BNC-3E, indeed, was a major upgrade over its prior design just on a technical level. But it was not a real, true upgrade. It housed a bigger, more powerful, and much more expensive engine for starters. This variant also used more sophisticated, less primitive armored plating. But it did almost nothing to advance the Banshee's weaponry. With battlemech technology spreading across the inner sphere by this point, and with new, cutting-edge, dangerous designs beginning to appear, the Terrans needed something that was not this incarnation of the Banshee, especially since it was even a step back from its predecessor in many ways.
More expensive.
Simply being more expensive to manufacture due to its massive power plant. With their leadership being questionable, and with their industries being heavily locked in, the hegemony doubled down on the BNC series. The Terran state built 5,000 Banshee BNC-3E battlemechs throughout the 25th and 26th century.
Okay.
The remaining BNC-1Es too were converted into this new, frontline fighting machine. The sad reality is that some military equipment throughout history has been more suited to be on parade than to be put into the field of battle. While the Banshee, when it was first introduced, was a perfectly capable machine, even a handful of decades later, after the introduction of the upgraded BNC-3E, it was horrifyingly obsolete. Thousands of these mechs were produced, however, where they were then put into direct confrontation with battlemechs like the WHM-6R Warhammer or the TDR-5S Thunderbolt. In fact, as border skirmishes and conflicts raged across the outer reaches of Terra's domain, it became increasingly obvious before the end of the 26th century, and even during the 25th century to some extent, that this mech was in fact a complete disaster.
Oh, yay.
The face of the HAF, the mech that was their staple, was utterly hopeless, and when tested in real-world fighting conditions, it was tremendously underpowered. Intended to be a credible breakthrough mech, or assault mech, with close-range capabilities, doctrinally this mech was not going to be able to perform at all. It isn't even fully known when the battles took place that displayed the BNC-3E to be a complete paper tiger, but it would fall between one of 3 time periods. First, it could have been during the wars prior to the Reunification Wars, just due to the mech being clearly upstaged by vastly superior heavies, despite being heavier and more expensive.
This is reminding me of something. I'm not sure what. Joe, this is for Ezzy's 50 BMG fun.
The second example would have been during the reunification wars themselves. Even when put up against forces comprised of a mixture of primitive and modern battle mechs with an over-reliance on primitive armor, the BNC would have been sorely tested in these conditions. The best evidence against this is ironically that so many Banshee chassis survived the reunification war era to begin with. The third and final example would have been the years after the formation of the Star League, though this isn't particularly likely, as outside of hidden conflicts, military clashes were kept to a minimum. Regardless of when the Banshee was revealed to be wholly inadequate as a military asset, it changed the hegemony armed forces drastically. They were forced to replace thousands of assault mechs with more competently designed machines. Even during these earlier times,
I wouldn't say they're more competently designed. It's still a decent design, but at the same time, it's just old. And sometimes you cannot start shoving new equipment into an old chassis if the new equipment's only going to do, a disservice to the old chassis. Just saying.
By the end of the 26th century, this would have been a boon to the suppliers to the HAF and the newly formed SLDF. Mechs like the Highlander would become a major focus and center of attention during this process as the Banshee was receding from service. And recede it did. Dramatically so. Factories on Terra and New Earth ground to a halt after the Banshee had proven to be toothless.
Nice.
Its skull-like face, designed to cause fear in the enemies of Terra, was nothing short of a mockery now. While it did take several decades to wind down its production, this nonetheless did happen in its entirety. The last Banshees walked off their assembly lines, and these factories either changed ownership, were mothballed, or changed production runs in the wake of the mech's failure. There was no direct successor to the Banshee, in the way that the Banshee had been a successor to the Mackie. If anything, Terra and its new Star League were beginning to realize private ventures produced higher quality products over their mostly state-owned enterprise, and thus, there was no need for a sequel to the Banshee. The mech was tagged with being a bad government-produced weapon system, and little else.
Oh wow, the government sucks at doing things. Big shocker.
This one-time war-winning machine quickly found its way into training grounds and militia formations, but even then, there was still an abundance of these mechs. They weren't decommissioned, but instead were deployed to other states as well. All other great houses managed to acquire mechs from this surplus cache of 5,000 after the formation of the Star League. However, even they didn't use these things in frontline services, as why would you? Many medium mechs could outperform the Banshee at almost any role beyond taking enemy fire. Bullet catcher isn't a particularly popular role in any army,
No.
it turns out. So, the great houses, much like the hegemony, use these for reserve formations at best, but often dump them onto training grounds. The Banshee was a mech that no one wanted. As a consequence, even after taking into account reserve forces, militias, and training grounds, thousands of Banshees were mothballed and stored away, rather than being outright destroyed for their parts. Likely, the reason for not just destroying these stocks for their parts probably fell to pride.
Yeah.
Could the Terrans really have justified creating 50 regiments worth of mechs that were deemed useless? Destroying them in public for parts would have been an admission of negligence and incompetence.
Oh, come on, we do that all the time.
Instead, whatever couldn't be passed off was quietly put away. If the Star League never collapsed, likely the Banshee would have remained an obscure machine before entirely fading from the collective human consciousness. The Star League, however, was not something that lasted, and with its fall, the rules of war and the realities of war changed drastically. In spite of all of its problems, in spite of all of its shortcomings and failures, rising from the grave the Terrans had dug deep, the Banshee began to shriek while it emerged to see war in the inner sphere once more.
Let's go.
First introduced in 2475 as a supposed assault mech, weighing in at 95 tons, the BNC-3E is the successor to the BNC-1E, and was envisioned as a frontline, up-close fighting machine. Shockingly incapable in its ability to take on this task, the BNC-3E, the first mainstream, non-primitive variant of the mech, and the most produced of its kind in recent history, is considered by history to be an abject failure. Let's discover why,
Okay.
while also going over some of the mech's virtues, as we look over this unique, though troubled design. Being one of the earliest adopters of intro tech, the 3E comes with a stock internal structure and gyro, and has a bonus over its predecessor, the 1E, by having a standard cockpit as well.
Okay.
This takes up a collective 16.5 tons of mass on board. After this, to keep the mech cool, and the 3 definitely runs cold indeed, it has 6 tons of heat sinks added, letting it once more vent 16 thermal buildup per turn. For its armaments, this is almost overkill, and many would consider it just that, given that one of its weapons will almost never fire with the other 2 primary systems. Still, sustainability in fire is a positive attribute, and oversinking isn't always disadvantageous.
Not really.
In regards to the mech's onboard electronic systems, the 3E comes with a DALBAN Comline communications package, as well as a DALBAN high-res B targeting and tracking system. Neither of these components offer the BNC any meaningful abilities beyond the normal function of the mech, however. To conclude the basic features of the mech, in the advanced rules, the BNC-3E suffers quite rightly from the poor reputation quirk, though latter variants of it would shed this reputation. And it also has the rugged trait, reflecting its durable and sturdy nature. While mobility is the most key asset of any mech realistically and determines the overall role a fighting machine may have, it is possible to overinvest in a single attribute, regardless of the tonnage bracket, and to acquire a poor outcome as a consequence. In the wake of the BNC-1E success, the designers opted to build on that, in improving the mech's mobility. Normally assault mechs can be quite sluggish, especially near the top of the weight curve. Instead of moving a lumbering 54 km per hour though, as most assault mechs in this bracket are assumed to, the bold decision was made to install an enormous and expensive 41-ton GM 380 Fusion standard engine.
No, that's just dumb. That's just dumb. Nobody looked at each other and was like, hey, we're about to install an engine that is half the weight of this mech. Just nearly half the weight of this mech is going to be the engine. That means it can't take a hit. That's just dumb.
This gigantic power plant gives the Banshee the ability to run up to 64 kilometers per hour.
Congratulations. Congratulations, you get there faster to die quicker. Nice.
Points in the tabletop game. It is also what condemned the Banshee to training fields, old military stocks, and rundown militia units, because it takes up so much weight on board the battle mech that it struggles to meaningfully function in any other way.
Yeah.
And its mobility, while impressive for its size, is just the standard motion of a heavy and medium lance in the inner sphere, even in the 26th century. This means it's not particularly agile even. It spends all of this weight on this very heavy frame in order to simply be normal. Giving up so much for it to have a humongous engine, the Banshee must start paying the price in other spaces.
Okay.
While it is not poorly defended for the era of its construction, one which predates cases, anti-missile systems, or specialist armor types, the 3E nonetheless is not heavily guarded for its weight otherwise. Being covered in 15 tons of Star Shield standard, the BNC-3E has a total of 240 points of protection. Many mechs in this technology bracket, 15 to 20 tons lighter I should add, have the same volume of defense. Again, this is not bad. The Banshee is unlikely to be removed from battle in a single volley of enemy fire, but it is certainly not as impressive as its more famous late-generation counterpart, the Atlas, which during the latter succession wars, it often was on the same battlefields as. To say that the Banshee is well-armed would be a fantastic lie. While the mech does sacrifice some protection to feed its gigantic onboard engine, most of the space to fit such an engine comes from its potential weaponry. Being less heavily armed than the 1E, the 3E, outside of its mobility, is in some ways a step down from its more primitive ancestor.
Oh my god.
To start with, in the right torso, the Banshee has a Magna Hellstar PPC. This strikes out to long distances, and can hole punch, though there won't be much of a follow-up to this system.
Okay.
Because after this, the Banshee has an Imperator A AC-5 autocannon with 1 ton of ammunition mounted in its left torso. This means that the Banshee, a mech designed for close-range assaults, has 2 long-range weapons, which collectively do not do very much damage. The last system in its substandard arsenal is a head-mounted small laser. Though it is argued often that the Banshee's real threat is its ability to punch and kick in melee combat.
Yeah. Oh man, that is... So, AC-5 and a PPC, and a small laser. This sounds like the loadout for a mech half its tonnage. About.
The problem with this is, frankly, most competitors to this mech can make the same claims to fame, and simply have more weapons to show for it. Punches are a great add-on to an already competent assembly of weapons. The 3E just simply lacks in this respect.
Make
The
punch good.
BNC-3E was largely left to languish outside of serious military service for centuries for obvious reasons. Overcommitted to its extremely heavy, and I must reiterate, expensive engine. It drags down every other aspect of a perfectly serviceable chassis. From its defense being average instead of robust, and its firepower being extremely lacking, the massive 41-ton tragedy that lays at the core of this design
Right, Red
simply
Hawk.
steals too much of the productive capacity of the Banshee for it to be a viable battle mech. Though it must be noted that any mech can be dangerous under the right conditions. An arrogant adversary that allows the Banshee to kick their mech's legs off, or has a lucky series of strikes from its inadequate weapons land true, can make this mech stand out under the right conditions.
True.
But these circumstances are born of foolish enemies or pure luck. Sometimes it can find use being a sponge for enemy fire, while more powerful, or fragile, and useful assets within the unit are put into position. But the mech on its own has very few options on the battlefield. The reality is, under most fighting conditions, the Banshee 3E is a 95-ton casket. Unless fighting the tamest of opposition.
Distraction Carnifex? Yes, sir, that's relatively accurate at this point. This thing is... It only looks scary until it starts shooting at you and you realize how little damage it's actually doing. And you just don't get close to it.
The first true attempt to modify the Banshee
Glory to Marik!
to a more capable combat machine, the BNC-3M is a product of the Free Worlds League, debuting in 2579. Clearly from the mechs the League had inherited from their Terran allies, the 3M is indeed a more reasonable, though flawed upgrade over the 3E.
Oh god!
Retaining all of the 3E's core features, the only differences lay in the mech's firepower. First and foremost, the 3M restores the 1E's pair of medium lasers,
Alright.
giving the mech more close-range firepower. After this, it replaces out its AC-5 autocannon for a second PPC.
Okay.
This means that at long range, the 3M can lay down the same firepower as a Warhammer 6R, or around that of a MAD 3R, both of which are more than respectable in the field of firepower for this technology level.
Okay.
What is the problem?
Oh?
It has the same heat sinks as the MAD 3R. It simply can't handle the increased thermal output of firing its two PPCs routinely. So in essence, it turns the Banshee into a 95-ton Marauder that lacks its autocannon but retains its heat problem. The main advantage? No ammunition on board to detonate. And it is much more thickly armored than a MAD 3R. This means that the BNC 3M is a big step up from the 3E. But is it good? That's much more difficult to define.
Okay.
It is still challenged for a mech of its tonnage. But it's more credible than you might imagine. Don't underestimate this one on the Intro Tech battlefield. It might actually surprise you.
Okay. 95-ton Marauder. Seems legit. Oh, God.
I am a descendant of Shiro Kurita, who seized the right of rule and forged the Draconis Combine. In my veins runs the blood of the emperors of Japan, whose imperial house of Yamato is the oldest continuous hereditary monarchy of ancient Terra.
Okay.
What's more, my house alone tested the SLDF and showed the rot within the Star League. By what right do
Are you sure about that?
we rule? By the right of a heritage which spans 300 centuries. By the right of might that conquers and expands the glory of the realm. By the dictum honorium that elevates and ennobles all of the people under the dragon. Join that heritage. Join that legacy. Join that glory. And the Star League shall shine brighter than ever for millennia to come. This I swear. As of this day, the coordinator of the Draconis Combine shall also be addressed as First Lord of the Star League.
Careful, Kurita. Your Davian is showing.
Kurita Minoru, excerpts from personal address.
Pretty much, sir.
1st of December, 2786.
The One-Eyed King.
The declining use of the Banshee during the Star League era was stark, which ironically is why the mech returned to prevalent usage during the years that followed.
Okay.
Why, may you ask? Because the Star League burned to the ground. The First Succession War officially started once Kurita Minoru unleashed hell by starting what Alexander Kerensky described as the Forever War. Though no one house is completely to blame for the complete conflagration of destruction that was unleashed, 2786 was the beginning of a stark and horrible contraction for humanity.
Yay!
Houses Steiner and Marik had axes to grind, just as the Davians and Caridans. And that said nothing of rivalries with the Capellans, House Liao, who had developed icy relations with all of their neighbors as well. Even when factoring in these bitter regional rivalries, the disdain was such that major raids and sabotaging efforts would be unleashed from all of the great houses on one another with time as well.
Of course!
When the war was fully unleashed, it was as if the gates of hell were opened. The First Succession War saw untold destruction. Centuries of built-up military stockpiles were let loose by the great houses on one another. Whole ways of life were forced to change across the inner sphere, and that said nothing of major worlds that were damaged beyond salvaging. These now dead worlds, even near the core of humanity, were so thoroughly ruined by war that they were delisted from star charts. But how was this achieved? Clearly, it was not the mighty battle mech that depopulated whole planets. This is a correct assumption to make. The fires that ravaged the inner sphere came mostly from the heavens. Warships were the great killers of this first, catastrophic conflict. But they were far from the only killers, with the prolific use of nuclear weaponry also taking up its title as a major killer and bringer of devastation. More people were killed in this war than any other Though gradually, by the end of the First Succession War, these strikes from the skies subsided. This was not only due to a loss of an appetite to inflict this horror on one another, but it was also due to a decline in the capability to...
Basically, they blew each other out of the sky in record numbers. What's up? Okay, fine. She just demands stuff as soon as she gets here. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. Fine, here, take it. Mainly, the Secession War was literally a bar brawl that was going to happen, and Kerensky was looking around at everybody, realized the SLDF couldn't stop them anymore because the SLDF was in pieces. And he just looked around at Karita, at Steiner, at Liao, at Marik, at Davian, and just they were all just sitting there, just grinding their teeth, looking at each other, and everybody was getting ready to fight. And he was just like, I'm deucing out because I'm not putting this crap back together. Because if I do, it's going to be worse than before. And of course, it was horrifying
to do so. Unfortunately for the sum total of humanity, key industries were deliberately targeted between states during the war.
Like cities, Mad Mergen,
as well as the people who ran and understood those industries. While this was not, as of yet, completely unrecoverable, these aspects of the economy and vital industries had become severely degraded throughout the First Succession War, just as a new normal seemed to be settling in after the fact. Just as something appearing like peace began to form, another actor reignited these wars.
Hi, Comstar.
Comstar, under Primus Conrad Toyama, Jerome Blake's successor and a holy figure to all who subscribe to the cult
Right,
that truly ran
Gearstar.
the communications organization, radically believed that the Inner Sphere had yet to burn out the cancer that humanity had been so stricken with to end the Star League. So, it was they who stoked the Second Succession War in 2830. Their own objective was to finish the job the First War had started. Humanity's access to technology needed to be carefully managed and controlled, you see. And it was Comstar who decided who had what and when.
Because remember, fucko, if you don't pay your bills on time, you don't need them. You don't need technology, do you? That's just how that goes. Yes, the glorious space Amish! Only less Amish now. This is them going into their Mennonite phase.
They would preserve all knowledge needed for when mankind finally was ready for enlightenment. But until that point, they needed to discard their primitive and destructive ways. So Comstar, after igniting this war under the guise of another actor, then went on to murder just as many scientists and intellectuals as the rest of the Inner Sphere did, as the entirety of humanity descended once more into a complete bloodbath. This was the death blow for truly advanced technologies in human space. The last warships in the Inner Sphere, the harbingers of death from the First War, did not survive the conflict.
There you go.
Scientific and industrial centers were absolutely mutilated, either by the successor states trying to diminish one another, or by Comstar finishing anyone who was educated or knowledgeable enough to rebuild the wreckage of these husks into something more respectable.
Yeah, and you see, here's the funny part about all this. It just gets worse and worse and worse. Like, when I first learned about the Second Secession War, I was just sitting there looking at the screen, just like in utter shock. Because every single one of the great houses knew Comstar was up to some illegitimate fuckery, but none of them did anything about it. Because they were all worried about being able to Skype call their girlfriends. That's exactly what the problem was.
Well, not quite as many people died in the Second War. It was so wholly destructive that it changed humanity forever. Violence was the only language mankind now understood, ironically. The peace which the Blakeists wanted became less likely as human diplomacy and even governance became inherently more violence-oriented, even in the aftermath of the conflict. But most tellingly, it changed the nature of warfare too, with strategic weaponry now being viewed as taboo. And in many cases, such as warships, being impossible to build, it meant that fighting once more became even more grounded in the conventional. This sounds great, except for one key issue. The means of building advanced conventional armies, including battle mechs, also plummeted. A good example of this is endosteel, a key component in many advanced weapons and battle mechs. The Inner Sphere lost the means to construct this material. The space stations responsible for making it were destroyed or otherwise were lost.
Of course.
So this vital material simply vanished. That meant that the people who made LB autocannons, or built light mech frames, too, had to either change what they were building, or simply stopped. With time too, the LB autocannon as an idea just simply slipped away. Plans were lost by companies or they went bankrupt. And the people with know-how were never there to pass on this data to others. With the one exception, of course.
Actually, Fox, this would be more reminiscent of the current stage of 40K. Not the Dark Age of technology, because the Dark Age of technology was really a golden age. The Dark Age of technology was really a golden age. All the good stuff came out in the Dark Age of technology. This would be the modern state of 40K. This would be it. When technology goes away, nobody remembers how it works to begin with, so they don't know how to replicate it. They don't know the science behind it anymore, because every single scientist, there is no scientist. There are people that tinker, and those are called tech heretics. This is the modern state of the Imperium. Once technology goes away and you stop being able to produce it, it's gone. Cole would say otherwise, but he is one among trillions.
Being within Comstar, where these were all preserved. The loss of this one technology impacted mechs and tanks on multiple levels, having a knock-on effect, but other technologies were lost too. Gauss weaponry vanished. Advanced extra light fusion engines? Lost. Higher capacity armor like ferrofibrous? Gone.
Nice.
Extended range energy weapons technologies? Another victim of this degradation.
Avalon!
It all eroded. And it wasn't just the systems themselves. Even battle mechs vanished during these two apocalyptic and tragic wars. The mechs which had come onto the scene after the Banshee had started to regress, like the Highlander for instance, became a rarity. No one could build the mech anymore. Eventually a refurbishing center and plant was established in the Capellan Confederation.
Woo! Refurbishment!
But this couldn't build Highlanders. It could only restore Highlanders. But that meant this mech was barely in existence. It wasn't just advanced materials the mech may have used. It was the mech as a whole, becoming impossible to replicate. King crabs, night stars, black knights, catapults, and countless other designs all simply slipped into the sands of time, washing away in real time as militaries began shedding things they either could no longer repair or could no longer replace. Ironically, it is in this environment where the 5,000 stored away Banshees began to re-emerge. Mechs once thought to be a burden on the battlefield were now put back into service. At a certain point, it was just better to simply have a mech, rather than to have no mechs at all.
True.
And with there being literally thousands of these machines sitting in storage across the inner sphere, they began to show back up again as the glow from the nuclear fires of the first two succession wars began to dim. Even during those conflicts, it was not hard to imagine desperate or pressed commanders pushing these inadequate lumbering hulks into service. But it is truthfully the aftermath of the first two succession wars, where the Banshee's presence is once more truly felt. When the Banshee first appeared, mankind was filled with hope, even amongst the collapsed Terran Alliance and the Age of War that followed. The people who built it, and the Mackie before it, had envisioned a future where technology pressed ahead. The men and women who piloted these mighty machines into battle believed in their cause, and viewed themselves as being at the forefront of human security forces. It was a giant, standing above the battlefield, and it was enforcing a Terran-centric political establishment's rule across the stars. After the Second Succession War, the Banshee represented decline. The mech warriors who sat in its cockpit were sitting in a machine they did not respect, and were fighting for people who had dragged humanity hundreds of years into the past. Instead of fighting for something noble, at least in the minds of the pilots, they were fighting over the wreckage of what had once been an aspirational state and way of life. The House militaries had imploded into feudal, squabbling organizations. Only the best of the best units resembled anything respectable in the eyes of a soldier only a handful of years older. The Banshee was also a rejected piece of old junk. instead of a new wave of brilliant ideas packaged into the ultimate military force. The armies that fielded these machines now were desperate and starved, looking for anything that could even pretend to fight. The people who had piloted them, too, were steps down from generations prior.
This is very accurate. If you remember Sven van der Plank's graphs on just how depleted every regiment was at the end of the Second Succession War, most of them had been most of the regiments that fought in the Second Secession War, far more than the first, had been absolutely culled. There was decimation would have been nicer than what happened to these divisions by a huge margin, because you were seeing losses of up to 66% in most units. The operational strength had been absolutely just mowed down. It was horrifying.
So yes, unlike before, the Banshee lingered over the haunted
Exactly,
ruins
Sarah.
that mankind had allowed their civilization to become. While competent, older variations of battlemechs managed to be saved in some way, with limited numbers of less capable mechs being produced annually. The capability for humans to wage war at all was dwindling. Many believe that the ability for mankind to even traverse the stars at all
Refresh
was
the
to
screen there,
vanish with
Epic.
time, truly isolating humanity and leaving it to die in the cold depths of the night. And despite this, another war began to brew in the background. This war, however, was to be in truth a war of the survivors, a war of rats scurrying around the destruction that had been wrought in this once beautiful garden humanity had grown and curated.
Fox, it's not as simple as that. It's really not as simple as it sounds to build something to that effect. The whole situation with the warships going away is essentially a loss of skill, a loss of tradecraft. And once you have those two alongside the loss of technology, it means you have to re-research and then build up the technology once again to be able to do something that you were able to do several centuries before. It'd be like if suddenly, FTL drive lost, something like that. You'd have to re-research everything on that. It'd be like if suddenly we forgot how to make plastics, and we had been making plastics for so long, it had just become second nature. The people in this day and age, if you took us and removed cell phones, Romans could build aqueducts, Dark Age peasants couldn't. If you took us and you just suddenly whacked cell phones, something happened where we just stopped making cell phones, lost all the designs for them, we'd have to start over from scratch, all the way back to radio waves.
In 2866, only a handful of years after the conclusion of the Second Conflict, officially the Third Succession War began. But this conflict was of a completely different nature than the prior two.
And remember also, Fox Leader, you also had the militant Mennonites out there killing anybody that had a thought. Okay, that's really what put the knife in technology right there, especially spaceship technology and everything else like that, is because Brother Jebediah would come along and hit you with a battle axe the second you sat there and started thinking, hey, if I take these two things together, my almonds fire. You're a scientist? Congratulations. I have something scientific for you. Several thousands of newtons of blunt force trauma to the skull. How does that work for you?
So much had been destroyed in the prior wars. No one had any true hope of winning anymore. The new war was never on the same scale as the first two. The missions most sides launched against one another, either with their own forces or mercenaries, were in-depth or even surface-level raids, trying to scrape what few resources they could from others to amass more stability
Alan,
for
what up,
themselves. Sometimes these attacks were done to simply acquire basic materials, and resources even, such as water. There were occasionally larger operations too, echoes of the military might that could be called upon from the past, but these were always fleeting.
They did,
And the
Fox. It was
conflict
called
of
the
slowly
clans.
grinding what was left of the inner sphere into dust simply continued along for over a century. Throughout the war, jump ships, the vessels that traverse the distance between the stars, could barely be repaired or built. This meant logistics chains for wars were always going to be complicated and broken. While planets changed hands, it was always just around the margins. Mankind had destroyed itself as its leaders squabbled over who was going to be the supposed leader of the long-dead Star League. Eventually, they were just fighting for survival, more than they were fighting for this faux goal. Worse, humanity by this point was fighting, perhaps because that was all it even knew now. This was the world the Banshee existed in. This was the kingdom that this ancient, dwindling titan ruled over, not because it was a grand war machine of note, but because it was one of the few war machines left to wage war with.
And that is a very sad statement about how bad it got during the second secession war going into the third. Say something real quick, There you go, Epic. Alan, thanks, bud. I appreciate it, man. You were kind of late due to playing Dune Awakening. I hope it's good, dude. I hope it's good.
In the wreckage and in the fire, the Banshee stood as
Epic.
the last mech standing in many respects, even if it was...
Huh?
Give me your cup, I'll fill it.
Okay. There we go.
no longer being built.
I've never watched the movies, Fox. I haven't watched the movies at all.
It was a miserable mech for a miserable era. But in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Inadequate, lacking in optimization, and treated with disdain by mech warriors of means, the rugged, centuries-old bodies of these failed mechs held against the darkness of the 3 succession wars by simply being amongst the mechs that were left. Though it should be noted that the bravery of those that took up the reins of these cursed juggernauts in this age of deterioration and savagery should never be brought into question. When raids landed on worlds in this skirmish-based series of wars, when people feared for their loved ones, property, and right to self-determination, whether in the hands of courageous militias, house units, or mercenaries, the BNC-3E was for many the last hope they had to survive, or to
And this is... Thank you, Beth. And this is very excessively true. If your only options are death and piloting a 95-ton piece of shit, I'm gonna pilot the 95-ton piece of shit every time. Just like Commissar Kane said, if your options are death or charging a Carnifex with a broken table leg, you charge the Carnifex. Alan, thanks, bud. It's pretty good. It also takes place in a time where Paul was never born. Never seen the movies. Don't know.
protect themselves in this despoiled
I need to watch the movies.
and unforgiving environment. Perhaps this one-eyed figure best represents the era as a whole. Upon its scarred, overused, over-repaired frame, when one looks into the face pieced together by the Terrans so many years prior, you could see the face of the Third Succession War. It best represents not only how foul it was, but also the grit, determination, and spirit that making it through a conflict alive in these times took. Great heroes aren't always the strongest, or the most powerful. Often, they are the ones who were there at the right time, and with the determination to make a difference. Regardless of its reputation, the Banshee in these wars is defined by that more than anything.
War doesn't determine who's right, just determine who's left. Glory to House Marik!
Yet another heavily modified variant of the BNC-3 and BNC-3M. The BNC-3Q represents the last generation of Banshee configured in the image of the original design created by an inner sphere power. Maintaining the 380 Fusion Standard engine, it still struggles with having enough weight for weaponry. This is yet another model implemented by the Free Worlds League during the late Succession Wars. The first of these units were assembled or converted in 2915, at the beginning of the 30th century. Also, ironically, the 3Q is also the variant of the Banshee that comes closest to performing its original job of being a close-quarters assault mech.
Okay.
Why is that, you may ask? Because the primary difference between this and its predecessor is that it is an actual close-range fighter. It has two weapons, a single small laser in the head, at this point something you should expect, and an AC-20 autocannon with 6 tons of ammunition.
You know what? I don't care anything about anything at all. The second you throw in an AC-20, I automatically like it a lot better.
That's right, it's got 30 rounds of fire for its head-clipping, armor-smashing autocannon. It's a fat hunchback with no medium lasers.
Yay!
More ammunition, more armor, and more internal structure to chew through. So, what is there to say? It is a slab of armor with a cannon on it. It is an assault gun of a battle mech.
Yay!
If it gets worn down at a distance before it can reach its primary engagement zone, then it's in trouble. But it cannot be ignored. And if it gets its enemies in its sights, they will be punched and autocannoned to death. The 3Q knows what it wants to be, and while it may be outcompeted by other designs in this respect, it is very much a worry for someone else to come across.
This thing is quite literally, I might not be able to outgun you at range, but I'm still gonna come into range. I'm gonna beat the shit out of you when I get there. This is so great. I love it. I love it. I'd pilot that. I'd had fun doing it too. It's got an AC-20. I can't.
Even among us Steiners, there comes a time when cold-blooded practicality must outweigh even family loyalty. My uncle has proven his inability to rule. As his niece, I grieve for his disappointment. But I will not let my emotions stand in the way of what I feel is right. I am Archon now. That is what I feel is right for me. More importantly, that is what I feel is right for the Commonwealth.
I am the Senate.
A royal court transcript of Archon Katrina Steiner in her announcement of Archon Alessandro's retirement. 3007.
Yeah, retirement. That's what they call it. Renewal.
The darkness that had fully engulfed the inner sphere in technological decline and ignorance was not forever. A multitude of industrial and technological advancements were made or rediscovered, with the most remarkable being the discovery of the Helm Memory Core by the Grey Death Legion in 3028. The discovery of this data store, though, often overshadows the innovations that were being made in the inner sphere even before it was found. Much like a mass extinction event in a biosphere, eventually, nature begins to recover as the new normal is established.
Right.
The Lyran Commonwealth was the economic power of the inner sphere ever since the collapse of the Terran hegemony. Not only did it possess the vital military and industrial center that is Hesperus, their general economic and industrial prosperity, though dulled by the Succession Wars, could not be matched. Only the Free Worlds League held a candle to them. Prior to the collapse of the Star League as well, the Lyran state was considered to be a scientific hub, with a strong tradition being placed culturally on the sciences and higher education. This tradition was very much preserved through the decline of the Succession Wars as well, as evidenced by the fact that in the early 31st century, the Lyrans didn't just reconfigure mechs. For the first time in hundreds of years, they built new ones.
Oh!
The Merlin was co-developed by House Steiner, for instance. And that was just the first, because shortly afterwards, in cooperation with their future allies House Davian, they created another new chassis, the Hatchet Man.
Karita shrieks in katana.
This also said nothing of the development of new
Timothy, what's up,
tanks
bruh?
of the Patton series, with Hesperus itself building a new fusion engine plant just to accommodate these vehicles. Frequently, those within advanced societies don't truly look at or appreciate the wonders that surround them, due to living in close proximity to them, and simply having the expectations that these services or products will always be there. Nations are their people, more than they are blobs on a map. The grand structures or machines countries produce are the products of generations of built-up knowledge and institutions. When the great houses engaged in the succession wars and annihilated their infrastructure, and deliberately targeted and killed the people capable of rebuilding it, it was nothing but a dream to reindustrialize in any meaningful way, instead of simply wishing new technologies into existence on
Jonah, I am visible from space myself, I understand.
an idea, and then people making it a reality. Any plans for a civilian or military product were restricted by the limitations that the state placed upon itself. The greatest contribution Katrina Steiner made to her people, to the nation she led, was her unwillingness to allow the decline to continue. The Hatchet Man, Merlin, Patton series of vehicles, and slightly later the Wolfhound, represented a concerted effort in money and state-driven initiatives to reclaim a fraction of what had been lost. In doing so, she not only produced new weapons for her armed forces, she truthfully enriched her people and created the groundwork for greater prosperity to come later. We all stand upon the shoulders of the giants of the past, and this wisdom clearly drove the Commonwealth's foreign and domestic policies. These mechs and vehicles may not have used new technologies, but they represented new infrastructure and an expansion of know-how and skills in the labor force and institutions. Institutions, infrastructure, and labor that the state and its military relied upon. With this in mind, House Steiner also embarked on one of the most ambitious projects of the late Third Succession War as well, when they opted to open a brand new mech assembly line, once more on Hesperus,
Ooh.
and this time for an assault mech. Building a whole new battle mech, like the Merlin or Hatchet Man, would be extremely expensive, even for the Lyrans. But re-engineering an old design, one which was still rugged and reliable, that was still a major project, and still represented a huge leap forward. But the cost of working on something tried and tested is often substantially less than building something wholly new.
True.
The Banshee was the target of Defiance Industries to make this new lord of the battlefield. With a fully mapped out chassis in terms of its myomers and well understood general mech functions, the BNC series was the perfect fit, in theory, for this new plan. Reverse engineering the mech schematics would be necessary at this point, though Defiance does appear to have had copies of Terra's old fabrication processes. Building and tooling a manufacturing line is an arduous and intensely expensive task.
Yes.
Even with the ability to work backwards from a completed product. But the Lyrans had zero intention of simply building the BNC-3E or even 3M. No, they had far greater plans, and those involved first and foremost tackling the biggest issue holding this steel titan back. They did the very thing the Terrans should have done centuries prior.
Notice something different about the Banshee? It's blue. Missile rack SRM-6 up in the shoulder mount. Oh God. That's a lot more lasers too. And big gun.
Downgraded the enormous engine on board to the common and reliable Pitman 285. With an engine less than half the size of the originals, the Banshee could not run as fast as it once did.
Okay.
But it finally had a reason to charge ahead into battle. Other major changes were made, rebuilding the left arm and removing the hand and replacing it with a devastating energy system, all while installing an arsenal of other vicious weapons too. What the Lyrans had by the end of this process is considered by many to rival the Atlas in its fighting capability.
Okay.
Some even go further. claiming that it is the peak assault mech of the intro tech variety. No longer was the Banshee a hidden-away substandard piece of equipment, acting as a militia mech, or as a part of the forces of the desperate. These brand new steel behemoths walked off the assembly line in 3025 for the first time, and as they did, they marched into the frontline formations of the Lyran Commonwealth armed forces. The material advantage they now offered was apparent to anyone who cast a glance in their direction, though their service record too, from the onset, was fantastic. In its first recorded engagement, a prototype BNC-3S in 3026 met Justin's Grenadiers during an attempted raid by the Capellan Confederation on New Earth. Their assault went horribly wrong.
Bad things happen to House Liao. I don't know, guys. I mean, I'm not upset about it. Is anybody else upset about this? Anybody? No? Okay.
As they faced unexpected resistance in the form of the 12th Donegal Guards. One Lieutenant Robin King, the pilot of this new powerhouse, proved just how dangerous this modern mech could be. The Grenadiers were stunned at the raw firepower that they were confronted by, and saw their forces smashed, with a full lance of medium and heavy mechs alone being lost directly to the new assault.
Ooh.
This level of destruction was only the start, when Defiance Industries' production lines began to fire up, producing these revitalized monsters. The politics of the Inner Sphere shifted wildly. No longer were the Federated Suns and Lyran Commonwealth mere trading partners. They would unite into one realm. This would have far-reaching consequences, as well as very immediate ones. Catherine Steiner arranged a marriage between her daughter, Melissa, and one Hans Davian. Katrina Steiner had proposed a cessation to hostilities and an end of the succession wars only a few years prior, but no House Lords agreed to such a plan, though an inquiry was at least made by House Davian. This, through negotiations, evolved with time into an alliance, and then a union. It clearly set a line across the Inner Sphere between two grand alliances. The Federated Commonwealth, the union of Houses Steiner and Davian, versus the Concord of Captian, made up of House Marik, Liao, and Karita. The former was unified, and the latter was decentralized. A fourth succession war was to engulf mankind once more in a storm of violence.
Hooray!
And this new conflict, a two-sided war, changed the borders of the great houses of the Inner Sphere more than any since the first. Much of the conflict wasn't driven by Steiner's political ambitions necessarily, though they had their own grudges to settle. In reality, this fight was driven by the political ambitions of Hans Davian. Hans was much
Why am I not surprised?
more the warrior than any of his Steiner peers, and that included his young bride. He had his forces preparing for years to make a decisive, unstoppable push into the Capellan Confederation, intent on acquiring revenge for the Confederation's attempt to replace Hans with a body double in order to politically capture the Federated Suns. Maximilian Liao had unknowingly sowed the wind, which meant he and his nation would be forced to reap the whirlwind.
Hooray!
Wife, in honor of our marriage, in addition to this morsel, I give you a vast prize. My love, I give you the Capellan Confederation.
What a shitty gift.
Hans Davian's proclamation during his wedding. Terra.
No wonder it didn't go.
28.
No wonder it didn't go well.
The latest innovations of the Lyran Commonwealth cut their teeth truly in this inferno along their borders. However, it is important to note that the fighting in the war of the most consequence was between four other entities: the Federated Suns, the Capellan Confederation, the Draconis Combine, and the Wolf's Dragoons. House Steiner all the same did play a vital role in many ways. Economic support of their Davian allies, who traditionally lacked in the realm of commerce and industry, was vital, though there were also significant military efforts as well. This wasn't a one-way street either. Deviant military advisors had helped the LCAF refine new techniques, though the quality of Steiner leadership in battle amongst state-owned formations has always been questionable.
Questionable is a
Steiner's
word.
great contribution to the fighting took on the form of Operation Götterdämmerung, with their invasion of the Draconis Combine. Originally meant to be part of a much larger operation against the Combine, where Davian would be assaulting from the other side, Götterdämmerung was still very effective overall in spite of this. Over the several years of battle, multiple worlds changed hands, and most in the Commonwealth's favor. Had the Combine not been fighting the Wolf's Dragoons in a pointless vendetta, or being isolated, still fighting the relatively distracted
Gamera!
House Davian, these offensives likely would have been nowhere near as successful. Another offensive opened up against the Dragon shortly after, and despite the Free Worlds League counterattacking successfully in several places along the front, they were bluffed into conceding their gains from their campaign. By the end of the war, the Inner Sphere had been reshaped in ways that few could have ever imagined only a decade earlier. Huge numbers of worlds exchanged hands. The entire central corridor of the Inner Sphere was now a bridge between houses Steiner and Davian. The Concord had been rebuilt.
True epic.
The Capellan Confederation and Draconis Combine suffered most during the war, taking on the lion's share of the losses, with the Confederation being particularly badly mauled, losing seemingly half of its some territories, and much of its industrial heartland. This turned it into a rump state, even after they were already the sick man of the Inner Sphere. At the spear's tip of the Steiner's victories throughout the campaign were the new designs that revitalized the military forces involved. Mechs like the Banshee, Wolfhound, and other new marvels overwhelmed their battle-tested adversaries on the field. And with the logistics support of the greatest economy in the Inner Sphere, they were able to achieve grand victories.
Yeah.
Despite setbacks, which the Steiners suffered as well, of course, they had played their role. Moreover, House Steiner didn't need a victory on the same scale as Hance's grand success against the Confederation. They simply needed to hold the line and apply pressure, which they achieved masterfully. For their efforts, and with Hans Davian staying as true to his word as possible, he gifted Melissa Steiner the newly established Sarna March, after the cessation of hostilities in 3030. Standing victorious over their enemies,
They got smoked. They got smoked hard.
the new federated Commonwealth, with the military of House Davian and the economy of House Steiner, seemed set not only to continue to succeed, but to restore the Star League and their own image even. That image, one may argue, might have been a legion of banshees and other immense monstrosities coming out of Steiner factories, striding towards their lesser adversaries.
I know,
The
Mad
mech
Bergen.
that changed the entire perception of the Banshee series of battle mech. The Banshee 3S is a monster made manifest. While it is a massive departure from the original, it is not as wholly changed as one might imagine, even if its fighting potential is vastly superior to its forebears. A true terror to behold, this Lyran forged beast from 3025 is perhaps the deadliest Inner Sphere intro tech assault mech, or at the very least is in contention to be ranked as such.
1 second.
More crime cat.
What do you think?
That's my baby.
What do you think about everything?
That's my baby. That's my sweet girl.
Do you have an opinion on what happened to Capellans?
Daddy, just put my head.
Do you have an opinion?
Just give me scritches.
Do you have an opinion on what happened to the Capellans?
Scratch her head, baby.
she is. I know she is.
Yeah, she gives kisses.
Yes. There. Yeah, she's still got that little fur patch. There we go. Guys, the war crime cat. She's the wee one. Yeah, the cat's less combative, but she is smaller. She is. Oh, let me get your paw out there. There we go. Guys, this is who I consult when I do any kind of like writing. If she looks at me like she hates me, then I'm doing something right. Ain't that right? She's purring. It's my yeah. Yeah, Sarah. She just looks mad all the time. Look at her.
She always looks grumpy, but she's so sweet. Unless you have 4 legs, then she wants to.
Yeah, if you ever hear any hissing in the background, hissing, like rage, it's because she has 4 legs, and anything else with 4 legs she hates. I'm just saying.
Yeah, she hates my mom's cat.
Considered a peer or superior to the
pugs.
Yeah, she hates the pugs too.
likes of the Atlas, King Crab, and others. It has truly left a
What?
She especially hates Annie because Annie tries to pet her.
Yeah,
mark on Battletech design as a whole. To see why, though, let us break down this Titan's components.
Let's go.
Using the second most basic technologies, the 3S comes with a standard internal structure, gyro, and cockpit. The same as the 3E even, as no adjustments can be made here with the available technologies of the day. Where things start to diverge is in its greater and needed emphasis on cooling, with the mech having a total of 11 additional tons of standard heatsinks installed, raising its cooling value to 21 per turn. This is absolutely a necessity given the extremely heavy firepower the 3S has on board.
Fox Leader, are you talking about Annie? So if you're talking about Annie, she's still with us. The other one, we rehabilitated. Yeah, she's still upstairs. We decided to keep her. We rehabilitated the other pup, and he's at his new house. But Annie
The one
is
that looked like a schnauzer.
yeah, the one that looked like a schnauzer. We rehabilitated, and they're at a new house, which is great. Annie we decided to keep because she's a big she's
my baby.
she's so fun.
She's big.
But she's brainless, which is great.
And she
Even
likes
with
to
this,
try to pet the other dogs by stepping on their heads.
My pug Sassy is angry all the time, okay? Angry all the time.
Yeah, she is. She's an angry dog.
And it's funny because Annie will walk up to Sassy and pet her.
By pet, you
Significant
mean take her paw and squish her head to the ground.
Of its weight massed towards this feature, it's important to note that the Banshee can definitely still struggle to stay cool. On the electronics front, the 3S is equipped with the same equipment as the 3E, in the form of a Dalban Comline communications package and a Dalban Hi-Res B targeting and tracking system. Unsurprisingly, these did not give the BNC-3E any boost in performance, and they don't give the 3S one either. Finally, as to quirks, the 3S has the rugged trait.
Of course.
This may sound shocking, but if you need to free up weight in a mech that has a gigantic engine, the best way to acquire said volume is to reduce the size of the engine. Which
You don't say!
is exactly what Lyran engineers did when they tackled this historic project.
Oh!
Downgrading from the prior 41-ton, 380 fusion power plant, the BNC-3S instead opts for the much more conservative 16.5-ton Pitband 285 fusion standard engine.
Nice.
This does indeed drop the Banshee's speed down to 54 kilometers per hour instead of 64, reducing it to 5 movement points in the tabletop game. There is a knock-on effect to this beyond saving weight, in other words. It is harder for the 3S to generate defensive bonuses, and rough terrain can prove to be more of an obstacle as a result. But there is a small trade-off, as you can imagine, in the form of it freeing up 24.5 tons of weight for functional and useful things, such as weaponry.
Uh-huh.
In essence, there is always going to be an exchange when taking from one area and giving to another.
True.
But in the case of the 3S, with its role as that of an assault mech, this rebalancing is easily worth it, given the intended fighting role of the mech. Interestingly, where things don't change for the Banshee is in its armored protection.
Okay.
The 3S has the exact same outfitting as the prior model, with 15 tons of standard plating. This is fine, though it does open the mech to being less defended than machines like the Atlas,
Okay.
or even the King Crab, who are relatively close competitors.
I really want to watch something on the King Crab at some point.
It's also important to note that while it is still relatively well armored, it has 3 tons of ammunition on board, meaning that it can be critically struck where these things are contained,
Right.
which will immediately, typically, destroy the mech. Also, for an assault mech of its size, it is armored like an 80-ton mech, which is fine for an awesome, but it is 95 tons, and it is slower than prior models. Designers felt that this wouldn't be an issue, and it largely isn't. But it can have an impact on the Banshee's battlefield sustainability if it attracts too much fire too early.
Right.
Unsurprisingly, the greatest changes to the Banshee are in the realm of offense. It makes sense, given that the mech being undergunned was clearly the greatest thing holding back the entire series. How Steiner solved this more than adequately. However, it is noteworthy that the mech largely follows the original weapons plans.
Okay.
And just expands
Black Wolf, you guys have a great night. Good night, Paisley.
outwards. The original right torso mounted Magna Hellstar PPC is retained, as well as a head-mounted Magna Mark I small laser. The original Imperator AC-5 autocannon in the left torso is upgraded to an Imperator B AC-10 class autocannon instead.
Okay.
The new cannon also has 2 tons of ammunition, so it matches the original number of rounds the first gun could fire as well. After this, more extensive changes begin. Its left hand is replaced to accommodate an additional PPC, though it is a Donnell branded cannon. Then, 4 Magna Mark II medium lasers are installed into the right torso, with an additional small laser being fixed into the center torso as well.
Yay!
And as the final piece of the puzzle,
Double the morale boosting.
it has a Harpoon 6 SRM launcher with 1 ton of ammunition. This is also found in the right torso. In totality, this is an immense shift in firepower,
Yeah?
especially if it is bracketed
Little bit.
wisely. In terms of long and medium ranges, its particle cannons and AC-10 will decimate targets with the ferocity of an awesome, and with a very similar heat profile to one as well. When things get in close, it typically will drop the PPC fire in favor of firing its medium lasers, missiles, and once more its autocannon, shredding targets, and once more doing so without badly overheating. In close, it's a monster, but at a distance, it's still a monster. It
Nice.
is very well gunned for its era, and even would have teeth by the standards of later eras, because it is so well configured.
Very nice. Who would have thunk that if you take half the engine out, you might be able to do something with this thing?
How Steiner found a true war-winning combination with the BNC-3S. As far as assault mechs go, it is one of the most dangerous intro-tech designs ever constructed. Fighting at range like an awesome, and fighting in close with the ferocity of a battlemaster, it is a true challenge for anyone who stumbles across it. However, it is not without its shortcomings.
Of course.
If not bracketed appropriately, it will overheat dramatically. And most notably, despite being relatively well guarded, it isn't in the context of its tonnage overall, which can make it vulnerable to some extent to heavy enemy fire, which it will face, especially with ammunition in both side torsos. Overall, if used wisely, if employed with cunning and an understanding of its devastating weapons package, the Banshee 3S will rule over any battlefield it's placed within. It truly is a phoenix, rising from the ashes, reborn and restored into a new, powerful form. One which serves its Lyran masters well.
Taking the massive engine out of that, as soon as I heard how heavy the initial engine was, I was like, okay, so this is why this thing fell off, really. This is why this fell off.
You'd trust a nation of shopkeepers to organize an operation on this scale? I wouldn't trust them with a picnic.
Huh.
Anonymous infantryman. 4th Crucius Lancers.
Uh-huh.
In the years after the wild success of the Fourth Succession War for the Steiner-Davian Alliance, turbulent stellar political realities began to make their presence known.
Oh, really now?
And the newly formed Federated Commonwealth sought to assert its dominance over the whole of the Inner Sphere. The victors of the Fourth Succession War became infected by their outstanding success, and the wild ambitions of the now unified families at the top of these states proved too great even for this grand alliance to handle. The Capellan Confederation had been the first victim of this new alliance. However, the Draconis Combine was the real prize to seize, as it represented the largest military force outside of the newly formed Federated Commonwealth itself. There was also, unsurprisingly, immense bad blood between Karita and both Steiner and Davian.
Oh God, no! If it's not the consequences of my own actions, I have no idea.
For a near immeasurable number of grievances. A new war was, at this point, being considered by the Steiners and Davians. This new conflict was to be the decisive victory for the Alliance, and a step towards the overall control and hegemony of the entirety of the Inner Sphere. There was only one problem with this ambition, though.
And what was that?
Namely, being the Concord of Captian had another, hidden ally,
Oh,
who
God.
was seeing to it that this did not take place.
Uh-huh.
Comstar.
Of course.
Between support from the Free Worlds League and the quiet hidden support from Comstar, the Draconis Combine had recovered largely from their setbacks in the Fourth Succession War. And in more ways than one might imagine. The formation of the Free Rosselhag Republic, a clever strategic move by House Karita and Comstar, also created a new buffer state which almost cut the overall border with Steiner and Davian in half. This allowed for the Dragon to better shift their forces on the immense unified border it now had to defend from their allied opposition. It also had another
Ari, that's not an incorrect statement at all.
fascinating benefit to House Karita and Comstar as well, as this act caused substantial unrest inside of the borders of their deadly enemies. By allowing the Republic to secede and become the master of its own destiny, in theory, it politically forced the Lyrans to cede worlds to them as well, drawing from several regions within the victories of the Fourth Succession War, and now other provinces began to make their own plays for independence. All of the great powers of the Inner Sphere knew the broader war had only taken a pause, rather than ending permanently.
Right.
Everyone was now putting together their ploys to achieve a final victory or decisive blow. One of the biggest advantages the Federated Commonwealth had possessed during the Fourth Succession War was a series of new configurations and battle mechs being at their disposals. In the years after the humiliation delivered to them by the Wolf Dragoons and House Steiner-Davian, the Dragon learned from their enemies, as well as their own errors, and sought to remedy this shortcoming with new innovative designs, as well as caches of ancient Star League mechs that had not been seen consistently in generations. These ancient and sophisticated designs appeared as a result of Comstar's generosity towards them.
Yes! So we started off with the Space Shamash, moved right along to the Space Mennonites, now we're at the Space Jehovah's Witness. And we're going to skip Mary right along to Space Scientology. Let's go.
BNC-3S was still the premier fighting machine of the era for the LCAF, which was still functionally its own military entity despite the newly formed alliance with Davian. The machine by the end of the 3030s had been produced for approximately 15 years, and had an excellent reputation amongst its pilots. While many would look upon the Banshee with derision in the centuries before, this had indeed started to change. Other houses still used the Banshee in its traditional form, but the Lyrans were gradually producing and deploying more and more of their own monstrous variant. This reflected, in many ways, the material evolution of the Steiner military as a whole. No great house in the first half of the 31st century could match the Steiners on almost any level in terms of the quality of their equipment, or in the realm of their support for their soldiers in the field, at least in theory. The real problem for the LCAF, and later their half of the AFFC, mostly revolved around the quality of the soldiery of those within the army. While many may argue that the condition of their troops on the ground was always high, and it was instead the corrupt, high-ranking officer class that held back the armies of House Steiner, this is not wholly the case. House Steiner is no stranger to military success, but frequently it has been factors outside of their military competency that have played into their achievements. The War of 3039, and sadly...
Like having one of the best names for a ship I've ever heard of. The LCS Yo Mama. Huh?
I love how she gives kisses.
I know.
Look at that little paw kneading.
I know. Look, she just grabs. She's being a brat right now. That's just what she's doing. She's just being a brat. Doesn't know what to do. This is just... You guys don't see this, but like half the time she'll be sitting there doing this and she'll get more and more annoying. Okay, get out. Now you, go be a cat somewhere else. Go annoy her.
She loves her daddy. Look at
No,
her.
I know.
She's back up.
Come here. Okay, fine.
She wants...
You want to watch?
Nicely. She don't like that.
Oh, there. There we go. Okay. Okay. There. Are you happy now? Are you happy? I'm just saying. She was adopted. And she
From
knows.
the Humane Society.
Yep, she was adopted from the Humane Society. Nobody wanted her because she was old. Nobody wanted her because she was old.
Yeah, she was the long cat there the longest.
Yeah, she had been there for like, what, a year and a half?
4 years.
4 years. She had been at the Humane Society for 4 years.
Her owner had passed away.
She has no teeth in her bottom jaw. But, yeah, she's my war crime cat. Yes, okay, I'm putting you down. That's her son, she wants to get down.
Later conflicts only proved how true this was. After the full integration of the AFFS and LCAF, it is more than telling that most of the military ranks and structure favored the Federated Sons doctrines, not the Lyran ones. Gathering their forces on the Combine border, Steiner and Davian, unable to conceal their play to knock out the Combine as a major power, prepared for the war they'd dreamt of, originally planned for 3035, but delayed due to economic and internal issues. In 3039, things seemed ripe for their opportunity to strike. The alliance required legitimacy, however, as it was decided that a true pretext for war was required, rather than just them invading on the whims of their leadership.
Oh, come on, like that stopped you in the past.
This was gifted to them eventually with the repression of former Davian citizens on a series of worlds taken by the Combine during the Fourth Succession War. This gave them the justification,
Yes, Fox Leader.
a casus belli, for their invasion. On April 16th, the Davian-Steiner alliance unleashed hell as they invaded several systems to begin their master plan of cementing their grip on the inner sphere. A brutal series of blows landed on the Dairon military district, with the Combine losing in fantastically quick fashion, much as the Steiner Davians had imagined. Combine counterattacks in this early stage of the conflict struck with no impact, and local garrisons and DCMS troops were simply swept aside by the exceptionally well-led AFFS and LCAF juggernauts. What they did not realize was that the dragon had been anticipating their moves and strikes, and while the local commander, Noketsuna, did his best, he knew no aid was coming from Luthien.
Hooray!
At least not yet. The invasion was even larger than the DCMS had anticipated. It was also sophisticated, broad, and coordinated. At least to the Cretan's perspective, there was little that they could do as a legion of Commonwealth mechs tread over their forces. The Combine's command structure buckled under their requests for aid and attempts to allocate their forces, even according to their plans. The situation was beyond perilous. Had it not been for the Gunji no Kanri, Karita Theodore, perhaps the dragon would have been slain. But instead, by May, the situation was beginning to be addressed by the very capable Lord of War that the Combine now had. The Steiner-Davian alliance simply hadn't seen the full breadth of what was yet to come. The invasion paid off politically, initially, for the new Commonwealth, and victory seemed assured. By the end of the first wildly successful wave in July, despite several small missteps, the Federated Commonwealth seemed poised to truly do as they intended, reshape the entire inner sphere to their whims. On their front lines, their battle mechs, like the Banshee, crushed any resistance they faced. Often, armor like the BNC-3S would be squaring off against inferior machines at this stage, in both design and weight, like the Panther or other similarly outclassed machines. While the DCMS also deployed very capable mechs, such as the Atlas, or the new Hatamoto Chi, or the recently restored Thug, it had nowhere near the volume of these assets to match the Steiners, let alone the Davians on the field, mech for mech, at least in the opening engagement.
And then all of a sudden they found a hatchet man, gave it a katana, and there we have history now. Let's go!
May the dear Lord have mercy on those unfortunate enough to get in our way, because we won't. Lieutenant
Alexander Anderson, will you go have a chat with him?
General Sharon Zardetto. The war continued, and with their successes so far, the next stage of the plan was to consolidate, and to finalize their gains in the Lyran military district as well as elsewhere. After this, they were to balloon out their footholds, squeezing out the DCMS before thrusts drove further into the heart of the beast they sought to slay. The primary strike from the Lyran Commonwealth was viewed as the weakest by the Combine, despite its impressive arsenal. Kathleen Heaney, the overall theater commander, had opted to, after the initial success of the invasion, utilize the Lyran strategic doctrine of simply crushing her opponents under the might of the LCAF's manpower and armor. This made for the worst outcome, as they quickly found full-scale DCMS counterstrikes ripping into their positions across most of their gains. This particular big arrow, known as Operation Winter Snow officially, was put into extreme distress. It only became worse when one General Nondi Steiner became severely injured, as she was the on-field commander for the operation, because afterwards her less capable subordinates had to take command, who then only exaggerated how poorly the Steiners were to perform in this region.
Yay!
In other areas, such as the planet Vega and much of the rest of the war zone, further counterattacks were launched, striking into the aggressors there too, with only the AFFS proving to be able to have the grit to withstand the anticipated DCMS assault.
No idea where, Hannibal. I have no idea where you've seen that before recently.
As the Steiner-Davians had expected a major counterblow at this stage, the real tragedy for the LCAF is that they were struggling to weather it. More disastrously for the Alliance still, their second attack into Lyran had continued, but at the loss of much of Wave 1's worlds being retaken by the Combine. twisting the invasion into an almost nightmarish scenario for the Federated Commonwealth. The second wave, too, suffered severely during the counterattack period, as while they'd anticipated attacks in the previous region, they'd been stunned when their new offensives met counteroffensives out of the gate as well, shocking their assault and grinding it to a halt.
It's not always the mech. A lot of times it's going to be the pilots and the leadership that go into this. Logistics does win wars, but it gets a lot harder when your soldiers are stupid. And the Lyrans do not have the competency in terms of their individual soldiers that the Caretans do. Just the nature of the beast.
As if all of that wasn't bad enough, the Draconis March itself, a Davian province, became threatened by the Combine troops shortly afterwards, showing a potential collapse of the entirety of the border region of the Federated Suns as several worlds fell. This proved to be too much for the Steiners and Davians to weather. The DCMS had gambled, in truth, with such an aggressive strategy, repositioning troops and expending almost all of their reserves to achieve their success. Had the war continued much on from this point, they'd have been shown to be exhausted. However, Hans Davian, seeing the utter failure of the front line, seeing almost all of their advances vanish, and seeing Steiner's inability to function properly in the campaign, called to a halt of the fighting. Shortly thereafter, the invasion came to an end, though not before 5 more months of grueling combat took place. In spite of being a draw, the war was a resounding setback. Even with the borders being mostly stabilized, it showed the new alliance was not invincible. And worse, it showed all of the flaws in their military tactics and doctrines. They had overtaken 4 worlds, but they'd anticipated taking 40. And they'd lost another world to the League on the border as well, as the Combine's allies did make some moves to give them the aid they could justify, without causing a full-blown war on another border, which meant that the Federated Commonwealth took a total of 3 worlds when the scales were balanced. It was hardly the glorious conquest they'd hoped for.
Right.
The operation to neutralize the threat of the Draconis Combine has developed contrary to our predictions. And with the assault by the DCMS troops into the Draconis March, we must suspend further offensive operations until said threat can be neutralized.
The war has gone not necessarily to our favor. Wow. Wow.
Prince Hans Davian's Recall Order, 3039. There was another factor behind all of the uncertainty in the wake of the setback as well. With so many Comstar-provided mechs showing up in the Combine's military, many of the Davian and Steiner commanders not only fought mechs they didn't fully understand or know, they were also engaged in battles with many mechs that possessed Star League-era technologies. While the Helm Memory Core had been rediscovered, to see large-scale employments of these machines at scale was more than jarring, and many speculated on just how advanced the Combine's technology had progressed. Even impressive war machines like the BNC-3S were comparatively primitive to an SLDF-era thug, or an assortment of other dangerous and deadly battle mechs that had fallen into the hands of the Dragon. This put the LCAF's hardware supremacy to the test, especially as more and more of these mechs appeared throughout the course of the invasion. Warfare had changed. The dynamics that allowed for the brilliant success of the Forced Succession War no longer existed. Increasingly sophisticated and heavily armed battle mechs were to be where the great powers pivoted to next. With the rediscovery of most of the Star League's military technologies through the Helm Memory Core, or through technology transfers from Comstar, the advanced nature of the newly constructed mechs within the Great Houses dramatically rose over the coming years. This was unlike the last 3 centuries of brutal warfare in the Inner Sphere, where things largely stayed the same outside of the figures involved, as there was now an arms race to be won. Stronger, faster, and with more refinement, a new era of battle mechs were upon them. The War of 3039 offered a glimpse into what was to come. The defense industries of the Federated Commonwealth most certainly recognized this for themselves, and began multiple projects to drive this home. Once more, new facilities were built, industries roared to life, and the new battle mechs that emerged from them in this process would be deadlier than before.
Oh,
Older
yeah.
machines, more so than just new ones, were also a part of this renaissance of technology, and the Federated Commonwealth strove for their armed forces to roll out refits of ancient designs, including, of course, of the Banshee. Having been rebuilt into a monster once in 3025, a new Banshee was on the horizon now too.
Whoa.
One which was a true revolution in assault mech warfare. And one that came just in time. Because another threat emerged from beyond the outer reaches of the periphery, one which changed the inner sphere forever.
Oh! All right. We're going to stop it here. We're going to stop it here for tonight. Deep space furry enthusiasts. Really, Sarm?
Slacker.
Huh?
Slacker.
What do you mean?
I'm giving you
It's
a-
2 Would you stop it? Would you stop it? Would you knock it off? Like, just seriously, just... War Pugs. It's... Now you got everybody dogpiling on me.
That was my goal.
Just why? Just why? War Pugs. So we have started off here learning about a mech which quite literally had an engine that was too big for its britches, okay? Too huge. And then once they did the logical step of taking half of that engine's weight off, they actually had a mech worth having. Guys, this is we're gonna be going into this next week. You guys are asking when I'm gonna play Mech Warrior 5. I could start at some point. It might be fun. I'm just saying. I do have it, but I can give it a shot. Bigger isn't always better. This is true, Ari. This is true. Guys, X in chat for Big Red, okay? X in chat for Big Red. Get some people that I can do co-op. I want to play with people that hadn't played before. I mean, that's just the truth of the matter. I like being able to play a game where everybody's kind of learning alongside me. I don't like being pulled along. Guys, I hope you guys enjoyed. Join me next week for Battletech Tuesday when we learn how the Federated Commonwealth screwed it up. Because they're here. War Pugs, thank you so much for spending some time with me. I will catch you guys next Tuesday. I'll see you guys next time.
Bye,